we're going to cover essentially 4 things tonight. We're going to talk about marijuana. So marijuana has been hot, it's been in the news a lot, and I want to start by letting you in on a little secret. A lot of what you've heard about marijuana is either incomplete or just flat out untrue. And we're going to talk about that. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the loudest voices in the debate with marijuana are people that have political agendas. So part of what they do is to try to distort evidence in order to support their political agenda. So we need to really dig down and figure out what the truth is about marijuana. We're going to do that tonight. We're talking about alcohol. So alcohol, I think, sometimes takes a back seat these days when you hear so much about marijuana and the third substance that we're going to get to tonight. And we can't fail to pay proper attention to alcohol, because alcohol, as we'll see, is as dangerous as ever. Particularly this time of year, prom season, we always talk about the worst case scenarios, what can happen. I know a lot of communities in the Commonwealth have actually simulated accidents and things to try to have people understand, see how hard it can potentially hit home when bad things happen with alcohol. So we'll talk about what the statistics are and the dangers of alcohol tonight, and really some of the ways in which people fail to understand the full level of risk with alcohol. And then finally, we'll move on to the third substance, which is opioids. And so again, if you live in Massachusetts, particularly on the Cape, I know, we've been hard hit by opioids. And I think a lot of people have tried very hard to make strides in terms of treating opioids and raising awareness. And whether or not we've made strides is hard to know. I know a lot of people are interested. Doing a talk on Friday, actually, with a lot of government officials relative to opioids. So we'll talk about that, see if there are things that we could do there. And then finally, we'll talk about treatment in general, because again, it's great to know what the facts are about substances, but what I want you to know, perhaps more importantly than what certain papers say or what the statistics are with substances, I want you to know what to look for. How do you figure out if somebody may have a problem with marijuana, alcohol, opioids? And then, what to do about it. Because this is what I do every day. It's hard to navigate the maze of different treatment programs, levels of care. And so I know enough to know that if you don't do this every day, it's really hard to have any sense. I mean, if you're never had any experience before with addiction and somebody in your family's got a problem, it's almost impossible to know what the next step will be. Where can you go? Where can you turn to? And so one of the take-home points, we're going to have many tonight, but one of the take-home points is that you should never worry alone. There are people here that are willing to help. There are people all over the Cape and all over the state, frankly, that are willing to try to help you get matched up with the appropriate resources. And so we'll talk about what that looks like today. So you got my contact information. Feel free to think of me as a resource moving forward. I do want to thank my funders. So the work that I do, the clinical trials that I run that we'll talk about a little bit, are funded by the NIH. So National Institute on Drug Abuse is the branch of NIH that funds my work. Also funded by some other foundations, both local and national, and so I appreciate their support in some of the work that I do like this, and then also the clinical trials that I run. And then you heard about the book. Feel free to check it out. Don't take my word for it, but you can look online, Amazon, see what the reviews are there. Really, the book is designed to do a little bit of what we're going to do tonight. How do you identify somebody with a problem? What might you do about it if they're addicted to marijuana? We talk about the hot button issues as well, medical marijuana, legalization, all that stuff. So, we can have questions about that tonight, but if you're interested in more info, check out the book. So what do I do on a daily basis? What does an addiction psychiatrist do? I treat patients. So that's another thing too. When you hear people talk about marijuana, let's say, think about it. Who are these people? What do they do? How do they really know, what the potential impact of this substance can be? So I know because I deal with patients every day who are, granted, at the extremes. And so that's something we want to talk about today, is that the dose matters. How much you use of a substance over a certain period of time makes all the difference. So people often assume, when you see a study, that anybody who is using a particular substance can have these bad things happen. It doesn't always work that way, and oftentimes it doesn't. But if you are using to a certain level, usually daily or nearly every day, that's when the bad stuff happens. So that's one of the points. So I treat patients at McLean Hospital. It's a psychiatric hospital. We have patients there that have every kind of mental illness that you can imagine. When one of those patients has some problem plus addiction, my team of younger doctors goes and see them. So I train people on how to deal with those types of patients. I've worked all over, including Cape Cod Hospital, which is a great hospital. I have a private practice, and then for the sports fans out there, I know we've got the lacrosse team here, but if you're a sports fan, you know, like it or not, the drugs are in sports quite a bit, marijuana in particular. So I do a lot of work in sports, the local pro baseball team, and then some leagues too, the NFL and the NBA. The second bullet is where I spend most of my time doing, trying to identify treatments for those people who are addicted. So again, some people use recreationally, they may or may not have a problem, but those people that definitely do have a problem. And so let's start talking about that. What does that mean? Addiction. What does addiction mean? So you can talk about manuals, psychiatry manuals and definitions, but I like a simple definition of addiction. To me, repeated use despite harm. That's my definition. So if you're doing something despite the fact that you're having problems, usually in multiple key areas like work, school, and relationships, that's when you have an addiction. If I'm thinking about, okay, where am I going to get my next batch of perk 30s instead of going to the soccer game that I was supposed to go to, or if I'm too drunk in the morning in order to go to go to work, that sort of thing. That's when your use encroaches upon your responsibilities. If you're high and you don't get your homework done, that sort of thing. So that's a simple definition of addiction. And so my clinical trials are aimed at developing treatments for people who are addicted to marijuana primarily. So those people that say, look, this is a problem, I want some help, I want to give them something that actually works, and that's what we do there. Third bullet's what we're doing here. So I think it's important not only to identify treatments that work, but also do something that we're not really good at. Physicians are not really good at letting people know about what they do, letting people know what these treatments are. There's a lot of great research that's done in Massachusetts, right? We've got MIT, Harvard, places like that, a lot of smart people. But there's a lot of great research that's done in places like McLean and other places that we just nobody knows about. And so what good is it really, right? I mean, there's great research that people at my institution have done that I know nobody knows about. And so then the question becomes, how useful is it? Do we need to do a better job? I'm firmly committed to this belief that there are two levels to this. We need to identify things that work, and then you have to let people know about them so that they can use these treatments. And so that's what we're doing. Particularly when it comes to marijuana, we need to understand there's a tremendous gap between what the science says and what public perception is. And part of that has to do with the fact that physicians and mental health professionals, healthcare professionals do a poor job of educating people. And then also you need to think about platforms, because I'll let you in on another secret. So I'm really happy that you guys are here, but if Miley Cyrus or somebody of her level of fame says something about marijuana today, they're going to reach a lot more people than I'm going to, even though I'm glad you guys are taping this too, that's great. But so it's important to understand the tide that you're fighting there. So try to educate people on this issue. I work in a lot of schools, public and private, with the Boston Public Schools. We're trying to educate all 9th and 10th graders on substances like we're going to talk about. And then the final piece is policymakers. So success has varied over time, but we're trying to help policymakers move forward with some of these important policies that we're talking about every day. So let's move on to marijuana. It's going to be a little bit interactive. So this gives you a taste of what I do with students. So if you're just going to lie back and relax, that's fine. I try not to pick on you, but would like some participation if you can. So I like to play when I meet with students, usually in much smaller groups than this, this sort of myth fact to get an understanding, to spark a conversation, because that's ultimately what we want to have. I can talk at you tonight, but that's probably not going to be as good as it can be. I know you guys have a lot of questions about this stuff. So we'll start with this one on marijuana, our first substance of the night. So common belief, marijuana is a plant, it's natural, it has to be safe. How many people think that's a myth? All right, so people, thanks for raising your hand, I appreciate it. Thanks for participating. How many people think that's a fact? Brave souls out there. Oh, at least a couple there, that's great. And that's fine, that's something that I hear a lot, and that's okay, because that's where we got to get things started to talk about this sort of thing. And so obviously, again, I want to couch it all in the context. So we're talking about heavy use, daily use, the level of addiction. If you do that, if you're using to that level, yes, it absolutely is harmful. It can be very harmful. So the studies are quite clear. So with marijuana, as much as people can have good debates about the pros and cons of legalization, medical marijuana, what isn't debatable is that when you're using a lot of marijuana, so daily, nearly every day, usually for a period of time, there are definitely bad outcomes that occur, particularly with young people. So that's another key idea to take home, is that the level of risk for these type of outcomes is far greater for younger people. So your brain develops into your mid-20s. So for some of us, it's all over. But for some of you, I mean, it's a really high-risk time. So you have to take advantage of the time when you're developing. What you do, the decisions you make when your brains are developing are critical, right? So argue with my daughters about drinking their milk, right? You're growing. If you don't drink your milk now, you're not going to reach your full potential. And this is the same sort of thing. Using substances at a young age, there's greater risk. So if you're young and you use marijuana regularly, then a host of things can occur. The first one are cognitive difficulties, so difficulties thinking. So we've done studies at McLean, brain imaging studies that show that a young person using marijuana regularly actually uses different parts of their brain to get the same amount of work done. It's kind of like revving your engine at high RPMs all the time. Probably not a good long-term strategy for success. Similarly, other studies that have been done around the country have shown that if you follow people over time, so this Madeline Meyer paper came out in 2012 in a top journal, follow people over time, the people that use marijuana starting at an early age and using regularly lost up to 8 points of their IQ over time that they don't get back. Even if you stop, you can't get it back. So that's a critical developmental period, really, up into the mid-20s. Moving forward, another key area with marijuana, if you're using regularly, worsening anxiety. So some of you, may say, wait a minute, marijuana helps anxiety. And that's what a lot of patients tell me. It's probably one of the top 3 reasons that patients say they use marijuana. But let's talk about that. If you're anxious and you use marijuana, your anxiety does go down. Unfortunately, at some point, the effects of marijuana are going to wear off. Then your anxiety goes back up. So you may try to medicate over time, but ultimately, your baseline level of anxiety is increasing. So let's be clear. Using marijuana, the plant itself, to treat anxiety is not a good idea. We have other treatments that are better. We may ultimately see certain components of marijuana be helpful for disorders on the anxiety spectrum, but right now, using the plant to treat anxiety, not a good idea. Also worsening mood, so worsening depression, if you have that, and you're using marijuana regularly, worsening depression. And finally, this really scary idea here, this last one, is that increased risk for developing a psychotic disorder. So you may have heard of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. If you have a family history of one of those problems, you're more likely to develop that problem if you use marijuana regularly, particularly at a young age. So it doesn't cause that problem, but it makes it more likely. If you have the genes for something, the genetics, it's not automatic that you're going to have that problem occur, or you're going to express that problem. But marijuana use at a young age is something that can make it more likely, actually 5 times more likely. That's what one of those papers says. So again, if you're interested in any of those references, let me know. I'm happy to give them to you as long as you don't tell anybody for copyright reasons, right? Like you can get into trouble for that, I guess. We don't want that to happen. So marijuana versus alcohol. You may have heard our president say a couple of years ago, marijuana, probably not as bad as alcohol. And I actually I agree with that on the whole, probably. I mean, he's talking about how likely you are to end up dead using a substance on a given day. But the marijuana-alcohol comparison, I think, is a good one. Because, as much as there are problems when we talk about using to the level of addiction, a lot of people can use alcohol and be okay. The data says that people can use marijuana and be okay, too. But I think a key difference is that as a society, we recognize that alcohol is dangerous, right? Everybody here knows alcohol is dangerous. You've all heard the ads and talked about ways to limit risk. Designated drivers, right? Think about how you're using. Think about how dangerous it can be if you're doing things under the influence. I would guess that none of you, or very few of you, ever heard anybody say, well, when you're using marijuana, you need to think about this, and you can't drive. Nobody talks about that. We really need to, because 22 million Americans used marijuana last year. That's a lot of people. The numbers have doubled in the last 10 years. So we need to think about marijuana like we do alcohol, potentially dangerous substance. One of the key factors, unfortunately, with any of these substances is, again, like I said, only a fraction of people are going to go on to develop addiction problems, but we can't predict accurately who those people are going to be. So, for example, with marijuana, it's about 1 in 6. 1 in 6 young people who use marijuana ultimately develop addiction. But as I like to say, if I have 6 16, 17-year-old kids in front of me, only one of them is going to go on and have really serious problems, but I can't tell you which one it's going to be. Okay, so what that means from my end is that, if a parent says, look, we found marijuana, or we think that, that somebody's using, then you got to bring the cavalry. There's too much at stake. And I know that, it can be a pain sometimes for kids, your parents are interrogating you, but they're just concerned. I mean, the reality is there's too much to risk if you don't take it seriously. So that's an important piece. I think we've got to get the messages right, and I think we don't do a great job with messages with marijuana, and we'll talk about that in a second. Why is marijuana so complicated? I think there are a lot of reasons for that. First one is the American way tends to be, look, we need to think about things as absolutes. So when you think about the policy issues, you kind of see that, right? People are either staunchly for marijuana, or they're, very strongly opposed. And they say things like I said, that marijuana is harmless, marijuana is the greatest medicine ever. Other people say, if you use marijuana, you're doomed, it's over. Both of those aren't true. So both sides, at times, are guilty of distorting evidence, like I said. I think that a lot of the answers with marijuana, even from a research perspective, are actually in the middle. So potentially dangerous, definitely. But a lot of people do use it without a problem. The second piece, people are misguided by their own experiences. So when I have a young person come in, and I talk to the parents, like to have them come in, I hear one of two stories often play out with marijuana. Number one, yeah, okay, we knew our daughter was using with the friends, but we did that too, and we turned out okay. So I get that. Problem is, marijuana from today is really nothing like marijuana that people may have used in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. So far, far stronger. Potency, as we say, strength, far greater. The other story has to do with opioids. People say, look, we knew our son was using at night in his room by himself, but at least he's not using heroin, right? And I get that too. But one of the points that we want to drive home here tonight is that people make decisions about what their drug of choice is. So somebody may prefer opioids, somebody may like alcohol, some people like marijuana. When they make that kind of decision, the level that they use to can make it really hard to distinguish what they're using. In other words, by the time somebody comes into my office, it can be really hard to tell who's using marijuana, who's using alcohol, who's using opioids, because you have the same types of problems. Got suspended from school, got into trouble with the law. My wife says, look, I got to stop using, or she's going to leave, that sort of thing. Work, school, relationships are key areas. And then finally, the idea about math. Math can be tricky. I don't like large numbers, especially late in the day, like now. But with marijuana, the numbers are huge. I mentioned earlier, 22 million Americans use it. So the people that become addicted, a small fraction of that, 9% of adults, 17% of kids. But as we talk about in the book, a small fraction of a large number can be a very large number. With marijuana, that's the case. So that means that although 9% of adults become addicted, when you think about that, we're talking 3 million Americans probably in the United States waking up first thing in the morning, using marijuana, using throughout the day. Those are the people that we see using to the level of addiction. So that's hard for people to appreciate because most people haven't seen that. So I get it. This slide here shows some of the statistics with kids using marijuana across the country, and it, to me, underscores a couple of things. Number one, how we need to do a better job of educating kids about marijuana. Number two, the fact that marijuana use is different than other substances, and therefore we need to understand it, and we have to get it right. We have to be on the right side of this when we think about policy issues. So this is Monitoring the Future. One of the key survey studies comes out every year, University of Michigan. You see here that the green line shows that marijuana use is unlike any other substance at this point. If we put nicotine up there, sharply declining. Alcohol, gradually decreasing. As I like to say, alcohol is as dangerous as ever. Marijuana use has an ever so slight uptick, gradually increasing. But the red line shows that while the use is gradually increasing, perception of risk, so how dangerous do kids think marijuana is, sharply declining. So that's kind of a dangerous predicament to be in. More people using, people thinking it's less risky. So that's a tough spot to be. Why is that? Well, I think a lot of that has to do with how poorly we educate kids about marijuana. Because when I go into schools, I see one of two things. Either number one, they've never had anybody talk to them about it. Part of that is because students in schools are terrorized or terrified of not preparing for standardized testing. Right? We can't take time away from preparing for the MCAS or PARCC or whatever it is in your school. Or, they've had kind of the scare tactic programs of yesterday, which really don't work. Kids kind of know the truth about substances to some degree. If you've got a few minutes, really, before they tune you out. If you're just hammering home, don't do this. If you do this, it's all over, that sort of thing. So I think that we need to do a better job with this in order to try to reverse these trends. Second myth fact for you. So, if you're dozing off. The second key myth fact, marijuana is addictive. Myth, fact. All right, that's an easy one. The degree of difficulty is going to improve here. We're going to get a little bit harder as we move on. So I think you can grasp, I already mentioned this one, that it can be addictive for some people, right? So as I mentioned, 9% of adults, 17% of kids, problems in multiple key areas. This idea of hard drugs, soft drugs, right? I don't like that type of comparison because, again, I want to drive home that point that no matter what the substance is, you can pick whatever substance you want. People can decide to use that to the extremes and have these kind of problems that we're talking about. And that's what we're getting at here. So this is, we showed a picture of the brain here. When you do things or substances or activities that are pleasurable, you have release of certain chemicals in your brain, neurotransmitters, dopamine. Probably you've heard of before. So that's what this slide is about. And as you can see on the right side here, amphetamine, stimulant like Adderall, cocaine, right? We know these things are addictive. We know that people, get a rush when they use it. That often gets people to continue to use. We got marijuana in the middle. On the bottom, I'll go with cheesecake. The point is that things that we like are reinforcing, right? When you do that, when you're shopping, gambling, using stimulants, whatever, dopamine is being squirted in your brain. So that makes you want to continue to do them. And so the point of this slide, why the scales are different, is that all three of these things cause dopamine to be released. So I think the take-home point for me is that as much as sometimes you hear people talk about hard drugs, cocaine's a hard drug, heroin's a hard drug, marijuana's a soft drug, I don't like that because, again, people make decisions about what they like to use, their drug of choice. And if your drug of choice is marijuana and you take that to the extreme, smoking every day, multiple times a day, to the detriment of these other key areas in your life, then yeah, it's every bit as bad as heroin in this case. So yes, it is addictive for some people. So that's an important point that we want to make. The other issue that we want to talk about here is that the consequences can occur, and this is blending into the other substances too, particularly alcohol. So when you think about people who are addicted to substances, we all have this idea, generally speaking, about people who are, the drunk, the person who's drinking every day, not working, homeless, that kind of thing. That's not what it looks like for everybody. So problems can occur with daily use, certainly, but it also can occur if you use today. You use too much today. If you use to excess today, you may make decisions that you wouldn't make otherwise. You may get in a car and drive, right? So you can be impaired under the influence of all three of the things that we're talking about today. Marijuana, alcohol, we're familiar with drinking and driving, obviously. Opioids, right? So we want to take home that point as well, is that it doesn't have to be somebody who's using every single day. You can binge drink. We're going to talk about that. You can use, lots of marijuana on a given day and get into these type of problems. The margin for error goes down as the degree of difficulty goes up, right? So everybody here probably knows people who are successful and use marijuana every day, and so I see those people when ultimately the margin for error becomes too thin. Somebody who is, a lawyer being successful, at some point, you're going to get to a point where it's hard to compete at the highest level. The athletes who are Division I athletes and, they use marijuana regularly and things work out fine, they go to the pros, can't get away with it. So that's one thing. People who use to excess probably and are able to get away with it. Ultimately, usually your luck runs out. Either you get into a problem at your current level, or you move up and the degree of difficulty becomes higher and the margin for error goes down. So that's something to think about. That's something that often does draw people into treatment. They say, look, I've been doing this for a while and I just don't know if I'm reaching my potential. I don't know if this job is really where I should be. I had a good education, that sort of thing. So that idea is something to take home. Yes, people can get away with it, but at a certain point, it's harder to get away with it. So let's move on to alcohol. Myth, fact. So here's where the degree of difficulty goes up a bit. All right, so I hope you're ready, on your toes. So myth, fact. The majority of teenagers binge drink. Myth. All right, fact. All right, so I think the myth people got this one right, actually. So one of the key points that we want to make with all these substances is that most young people don't do this, right? So I know it seems that way. So one key thing, there's a series of studies that have been done that show that kids in high school and their parents think that way more people use all of these substances than actually do, right? If you're a young person who made the decision, I'm not going to drink, you kind of think, well, everyone else is doing this, I'm missing out on something. Well, actually, truth is, most people don't do that. A lot do it, and so those that we're concerned about, the levels of use are still too high, but it's not the norm, right? 22% of seniors and 14% of sophomores in this case have binge drank in the last month, having 3 or more drinks, using to extreme on one particular day or over a series of days. It's not the norm. So people are making the right decision more often than not, actually. But obviously, when there's so much at stake and you can have such dramatically bad outcomes, that's why we always want the numbers to go down. Another myth, fact. Teen drinking and driving has increased in the past 20 years. Myth. Fact. All right, so they are getting harder, right? But everyone raising their hand, I appreciate that. A lot of people are passing on it at this point. I don't know if they are worried. I really can't tell who's missing them. There's too many people. It's kind of dark. So yeah, that's a myth. Teenage drinking and driving has dramatically decreased in the last several years. So I want you to know that, but I also want you to know, probably more importantly, what this means to me. What this means is that, as we talked about marijuana before, how we need to do a better job of educating kids about marijuana, this kind of slide shows that we do a pretty good job of educating kids about alcohol. We do a pretty good job of educating kids about cigarettes and nicotine, right? Everybody knows alcohol's dangerous. Everybody knows that cigarettes are bad for you. I've never had a patient come into me, ask to have me help them stop smoking cigarettes, and say, look, I love this. This is great. But I really, I need to stop. Somebody says I need to stop, right? That never happens. In marijuana, it's very different, right? People feel there's at least some perceived benefit, and that's part of the work. I know you think it helps you in this way, but these other areas we're having problems, so we need to talk in a risk-benefit fashion. But we know this stuff with alcohol, right? So drinking and driving has gone down. I think the message is pretty clear, but it also is still far too common, right? It just happens. It's a temptation that's there, and people make bad decisions. That's always happening to some degree, and we need to work as hard as we can to try to decrease those numbers. And I think, again, it's important to hammer home this alcohol point, because I know you're hearing way more about marijuana, way more about opioids than you are about alcohol right now. And the fact of the matter is, when you think about total societal costs, the costs of alcohol use dwarf everything else, because more people use alcohol than these other substances. So again, we want to pay the amount of attention to it as we should. So now we're moving on to the big guns, opioids and the opioid epidemic. Opioids, like heroin, more addictive than alcohol and cocaine. Myth. Fact. All right, pretty good. Yeah. So opioids are easy, okay, when it comes to this type of thing. These are the worst substances that you can possibly talk about. They are more addictive. This slide actually talking about a quarter of people who use heroin become addicted. I personally would think it's a little bit higher, because these are deadly, deadly drugs. I can't drive that point home enough. So from a practical perspective, from my end, when somebody in my family is going to have surgery, or they're going to go to the hospital, you got to be careful when people talk about using Vicodin, Percocet, that sort of thing. Now, do you really need it? Because these are the strongest drugs that you're going to come across. And for those of us, I'm one of those people with a family history of addiction. People with a family history of addiction are at higher risk. They may never have abused substances themselves, but when you expose them to really powerful drugs like opioids, they're at higher risk. So I think, in terms of from a practical perspective, any use of these medicines from your dentist, from the ER, from your surgeon, you need to think carefully. I'm not saying that there isn't a role for them, but just be aware. These are really, really dangerous substances, and we'll talk about it's really easy these days to make a transition. So what happens over and over and over again, somebody has a accident, they go to see the surgeon, or they go to the ER, and they get a script for opioids. And a lot of them, they take them, and they're like, wow, I've never had anything like this before. And that might be fine, they might go about their business, heal up, and that sort of thing. But that thought of, wow, this is the most powerful drug I've ever had before, stays with them. And there are times when different things are happening, but that thought never goes away, and sometimes people return to that. If they do that, they begin to continue to use or abuse those substances. A prescription opioid is hard to get. You might be able to get another script, but ultimately you're not going to be able to do that forever, probably. And then you're going to try to buy them or find them or steal them. And prescription opioids are expensive. It's about $1 a milligram or so on the street. And ultimately, many people are faced with a choice saying, look, I've stolen what I can to buy Perk 30s or whatever, but this bag of heroin here is, far, far cheaper. So the end result is people that you would never, ever, ever imagine shooting heroin end up doing it. That's what we've seen over and over again, not just in Massachusetts, but around the country. But it's important to keep in mind. So I do like this slide, relative addictive potential. Opioids are really at the top. And I think that idea is accentuated by the fact that when you talk about the ability to end up dead on a given day, you can't beat opioids. That's part of the problem. If you've never used opioids before, you use them, you can end up dead. If you use them for a while and you stop, or you get a bad batch, it has something else in it. Fentanyl is a drug, you may have heard it before, far stronger than heroin. So if there's some fentanyl in that batch, people end up dead, and it happens every day throughout Massachusetts and all over the country. And that's why this epidemic is gripping us because people are dying literally every day. This slide here shows that while all groups, so you got 2013 in green here, and 2000 in the darker blue, everyone's using opioids more. All groups are. But that young group in particular, so 18 to 44, Caucasian, I mean, that's the big group here. You know, a lot of these folks live on the Cape. You know, so that's what we've seen. Everybody's increasing more opioids, you know, for a variety of reasons, some of which we'll talk about. But that younger group is especially hard hit with that. Why are overdoses on the rise? Some thoughts, some of which you've heard of before, but there's just more prescriptions for prescription opioids for pain, right? Physicians like me were taught a few years ago that, you know, pain's the fifth vital sign. How do you measure somebody's pain? Well, there's a scale that has like smiley faces on it. People just, it doesn't sound very scientific, but that's what we do. So people are saying they're in pain, you're going to throw powerful medications at them. There's also this era of, you know, if you come in to see me and you may rate your visit online, and, you know, if I don't give you what you're looking for, are you going to give me, you know, 1 star, that sort of thing? So there's a lot of pressure there. Certainly, that's something to consider. We talked about this transition from prescription opioids to heroin, and then again, stronger heroin is available. So it ups the ante. I mean, when you think about it, part of the reason that the heroin is stronger is because with more people selling it, if you're going to sell it or competing against people, you got to do something to distinguish yourself. You want a stronger product. And so that stronger product is going to bring more sales to you. So those are the facts about those 3 substances, and we can answer more questions about it. But let's move on to treatment, because again, I think that's a real important piece here, because there are more substances than the 3 we talked about, but the commonality is when somebody's using to that level of addiction, how do you get treatment if you decide that you need to or somebody thinks that you should? Typical case here, Johnny, 16-year-old high school sophomore, no previous addiction history, never seen a psychiatrist before, suspended after he was caught selling marijuana. So kind of like drunk driving, right? If you get caught selling marijuana, there's a good chance you're using too much marijuana, right? So there's a lot that has to happen for somebody to get on the radar, usually with marijuana. You know, it's usually a significant habit if something like this occurs. So this Johnny was using 4 or 5 times a day for 2 years with friends. Says, I'd rather be messed up, Doc. Messed up, messed is not the verb he used, actually. But I think you understand what I'm getting at, right? So we'll go back to Johnny in a minute. But what do you look for? How do you decide, you know, this is something we got to do something about? Well, I think you got to think about, you know, what is normal for somebody. So in order to figure that out, you got to know what normal is. And so for kids, I mean, there are things that can get things on the radar, right? You can have somebody who's a usually pretty agreeable kid, all of a sudden he's getting in fights, or having problems at school, grades are going down, so social problems, giving up activities. So, you know, in this day and age, people are playing sports year-round, travel sports. So if you're somebody that, you know, a soccer player, you get to sophomore year, Johnny's a soccer player, he stops playing soccer in his sophomore year. Just because he stopped playing soccer doesn't mean he has a marijuana problem, but it might, right? It's worth looking at, asking some questions for what's going on. I mean, you've been placed year-round for 10 years. Why aren't you playing anymore? I mean, it's worth a conversation. Use in dangerous situations, so that's usually kids in cars with marijuana, let's say, or drinking, that sort of thing. And then this piece here, the last piece, is really the most common thing that I see. This is when people are sent to me, by other docs in particular. Use despite obvious other problems. So they may be diagnosed, they may be already treated. So we're talking about anxiety, depression, ADHD. So a doc could call me and say, look, you know, I've been treating this young gentleman for a couple of years now. I had him on a bunch of stimulants, nothing's working, and all of a sudden, you know, we figured out that, you know, he told me that he's using marijuana every day. And so, you know, that's why it's not working. Or somebody's seeing a therapist, they're taking Celexa, it's not working. What could be going on, right? These are things, using substances, drinking regularly, binging on alcohol, or using marijuana, that can make it hard for other treatments to actually work. All right? So people can be on the trail and not quite figure out the whole story. That happens a lot. So what do you do? How do you have a conversation if you think something's going on? I think there are really 4 key steps that we'll talk about. I talk about this quite a bit more in the book too. Preparation, conversation, evaluation, and referral. Preparation, build it before you need it. You got to have the ability to have conversations that matter. So I have a patient in my private practice, the age of some of the younger people out here. He tells me, look, my dad talks to me about 2 things, the Red Sox and the weather. That's not going to cut it. I come from a family like that, I have to admit. But that's not the level that we need, right? You got to be able to talk to your kids about important stuff. And so again, I mentioned my daughters, they don't want to answer the questions that I ask them either, but you have to ask the questions. They're not going to want to answer in your time frame, but by asking the questions, you're saying that this is important. So that if you do that, hopefully, when things are going down, bad things are happening, they're going to be willing to talk to you. I think it's underscored by this era of technology, right? We just don't do that very much. If you go out to a restaurant and you see a family there, everybody's got their heads in there, looking at their phone, that sort of thing. So having conversations, talking to people about important things, not very common. Have an idea about what you're going to say if there is a problem. What are you going to do? If they say they're willing to get help, where are you going to go? If they say no, what are you going to do? Because that's a problem too, right? A lot of people are met with resistance, and when you get that initial resistance, a lot of people don't know what to do after that. So there are ways that we can work around that. The conversation's pretty simple. 2 things. I think number 1, what do you say? I think you just say, look, if you're a parent, you're a teacher, or a coach, I'm worried about you. I think you need an evaluation. I think you need to see somebody. So you're not making a diagnosis. You're not the bad guy. You're just saying, look, this is probably above my pay grade. I don't know what's going on. I want you to talk to somebody who does this every day. That's what you need to do. And ultimately, who you see, there are great people who are doctors, psychologists, social workers. The alphabet soup stuff, I don't care as much about that, but they better be good because the window of opportunity is not open very long. And then to think about what will get somebody to try to get help, I think, that's a question that I often have to ask too. What is important to somebody? What are they afraid of losing? Right? And it's the tangible things. So again, we talked about a lot of studies today. I've never had a young person come in to me and say, hey doc, look, I heard I could lose up to 8 points of IQ if I keep using weed. Help me stop. Right? It's never happened. It's probably not going to happen. But what they do care about is, look, I want to go to Dartmouth. I want to play in the sectionals in 3 weeks. I want to keep using the car. That kind of stuff, like more tangible stuff. That's what you got to figure out. We'll get back to that in the evaluation too. So like I said, there are people that want to help you. You got to talk to somebody who knows what they're doing because the windows are open small. And in that assessment, a big part of what I do, as much as I believe in, we're studying medications, we study different types of therapy, the biggest thing that I can do, and the biggest thing that any therapist can do if they're good, is to build an alliance with somebody. Like I said, with technology, talking to somebody, having a conversation is kind of rare. So if you do that, if you're listening to somebody, they say, wait a minute, this person, seems to be interested in what I'm saying. Hopefully by the questions that you ask, you let them know that you know a few things about it. And then if you've done that, you build that alliance, ultimately, they're going to be willing to come back when they want to get some help. So that's another kind of secret here, or not so secret in my case, is that a lot of people don't want to do what I think they should do right away. I want to be clear about what that is. We're going to talk about that in referral, but a lot of times it takes some time for somebody to get ready to get help. And the hope is they decide to do that before they've lost everything. In terms of this MI here, motivational interviewing, what that means, it's kind of just a psychobabble term in some ways, but what I think about that as being is that, when we talk about the tangible things, is that part of my job in that evaluation is to figure out, what's one reason that they would change their use of marijuana, alcohol, opioids, whatever it is. Because their one reason's better than 10 I could give them. So my job is to figure out what's important to them. If I get that one thing, that they care about, sports or their future, what they study, that sort of thing, then I feel like I'm good. I feel like I can get the rest. We can make the rest work. So I got one hook there. In terms of referral, what does treatment look like? So highest level to lowest level, residential care. It doesn't happen all that much, So I like some of the TV shows that you guys have seen, but most times people aren't getting on a plane, going away for 6 months. It's not reality. It's outpatient care. A lot of great outpatient care on the Cape, Gosnell, there are other places that really do a nice job. So you're living at home, you're going somewhere. If things are really bad, you're in what we call a partial program, let's say. That's every day for 2 weeks, let's say, that sort of thing. Ultimately, you might be talking to a therapist or a counselor, and then groups, which brings me, we'll talk about this in the Q&A, so this, a lot of 12-step on the Cape here. These dry dock folks who approach me, so it seems like they're doing a great job. Big believer in self-help groups, I think they're very, very helpful. So I think they have a table out there. The point is that even if you're seeing a therapist, if you're taking a medicine that you should be taking, that's a couple hours a week at best. And if you can, have a group that you go to with people who are in a similar position that have been around the block, that can be very, very helpful and very, very powerful. So I definitely endorse that where possible. What does treatment look like? Depending on the substance, detox may not be necessary. Really, of the 3 substances we talked about tonight, alcohol is the only substance that you absolutely have to do a detox from. Because the reality is, if you're using alcohol every day, stop abruptly, you could have a seizure and that can be fatal. So insurance companies will pay for you to do detox. And they don't want to pay for much, as you probably know. So they'll pay for that. Opioids, even opioids. It's hard to get an inpatient detox. So opioid withdrawal, while very, very uncomfortable, is not life-threatening. So that's a distinction that's made. Like I said, you're not going to go away to rehab, generally speaking. You just want to talk to somebody and do that alliance work that I talked about before. So back to the case. We'll get to some closing thoughts and some Q&A, which I think will be interesting. So Johnny started talk therapy. The idea was he was going to see a therapist once a week. If things went well, you keep doing that for a while. If things don't go well, you increase the level of care. So you might go into a program, right? So this is not a static thing. This changes depending on how people are doing, which is why you need to see somebody so they can get a sense for how you're doing. It's not like you go in one time and that's it. That's not going to work. He talked about in his treatment, why he felt the need to get messed up on the weekends as opposed to facing things, as his sober self, as we say. So those are difficult issues and it takes time to work through. So to sum it up, awareness is really the name of the game. So you're ahead of things by being here, and I appreciate that. I would guess you probably have done some other things on your own to learn about this, so you're continuing to make progress, and that's great. Communication is key, right? It's hard to do in this era of technology, right? We're texting people, we don't like to talk anymore, like to send emails that people misconstrue. And so communication is huge. You got to be able to have these talks that are hard. If you're going to support somebody, if you're going to try to help somebody, if you're going to have an idea of how they're really doing. So in the community and in the family, usually there are people that want to help you. Definitely true in the community here. Never worry alone. It's a helpful thing to say all the time. And again, you should never be struggling on your own when there are a lot of people that do want to help you. And I know that's the truth. The Cape definitely. And then the final thought here is, again, an important thought. So you guys heard many, many horror stories about addiction. People who end up dead, lose their lives, wreck their families' lives, that sort of thing. I want you to know, if you're not aware of this, no matter what the substance is, no matter how bad it can be, people get better. That's why I do this. Some people don't get better, but people do get better. A lot of times they're the people that you would never expect to get better. People who are shooting a gram of heroin for more than a year. They've been in treatment a whole bunch of times. They come to see me and like, what am I going to do? But sometimes those are the people that get better if you really work at it. Maybe there are things they haven't done. They haven't really done all the things that they could possibly do. Maybe they just haven't had somebody in a while that really cares about how they're going to end up. So people do get better. I think that's one of the most important things that I can emphasize tonight is that it's never hopeless, no matter how bad it can seem. It can definitely seem really bad, I know at times, but people want to help you, and you definitely can get better. So I've got some time to take some questions. I know we've got tables out there, but I'll take some questions now. And then when it's time to disperse, I'll be down here and I'll answer some more questions. So thanks for your attention. Thanks. And if you don't have a mic out there, I'll repeat the question. Thanks. So we'll start there, right there.
It seems as if at times lethal overdoses come after someone has been clean for a period of time, or they've just gotten out of rehab. Is that because there's a change in tolerance?
Yes. Yep, so the question was, sometimes people overdose on opioids right after they exit treatment. So why are you more likely to have that occur? And you correctly asked, does it have to do with tolerance? So tolerance is, the body's acclimating to a particular substance. So you need more and more of the substance to get the same effect. So if you're somebody that uses Perk 30s, you're going to need more of that in order to get the same effect. A lot of times people who are using opioids, they'll tell you that they've been using for a while. They don't get high anymore. It's just a question of preventing withdrawal symptoms. But the reality is when you go in to do a detox, you've been free from opioids for a while, your body is repairing itself more or less, and your tolerance goes down. So you're at high risk. So that's something that we see. People get great treatment, whether it be detox, whether it be within a residential facility, but when you leave, danger is high because you're putting somebody back in an environment that has a lot of triggers, and we're talking about deadly substances. So that is why people are especially high risk right after treatment. Yep, right there.
Can you recommend a book for somebody that is an opiate addict in recovery?
In terms of what aspect? So we're talking about books for opioid addiction.
Yeah.
Is there some aspect of it that you're concerned about, or think you need more guidance?
Well, it's a person in my life that just hasn't. I think it's been probably 8 years of struggling with addiction, and I'm trying to find inspirational reading, but factual, kind of something that would hit all of those.
Yeah, there are a lot of memoirs like that. None of them jump to mind for me. There are a lot of success stories. I was in Weymouth last night talking to a group like this, and Chris Herron is somebody who's had one of those success stories. So I think that can be inspirational for people. It depends. I can't recommend one particular book. I think there are a lot of areas that you can go to for just to have that notion reinforced that this is not hopeless. Other questions right there. Yep.
Hi, in your practice, how do you deal with lack of motivation to recover?
Yep. So in my practice, how do you deal with lack of motivation or resistance or really not wanting to be there? So we deal with it all the time, especially with marijuana. So marijuana is something that it's very rare that people are going to call me up and say, I got a problem with weed, I need to get help. So people who are pushed in to see me, another kind of a secret, if you make it into my office, I know a part of you recognizes that you got to be there, right? So there may be a lot of resistance, but again, if I do this the right way, if I build that alliance and talk about things that we may have in common, or if I'm trying to figure out what's important to you, I can build upon that. Just to point out what the differences are, on my consultation service, there may be people who have absolutely no interest in getting help. When you drop into a unit, where people are depressed, let's say, and you're asked to see them by their team, they may not be any interest. But if somebody's parents, employer wants them to see me in my private practice, let's say, in my office, I know that if they made it there, there's a part of them that wants help. And so motivational interviewing, you talk about stages of change, Prochaska and DiClemente, just if you want to look at that reference, talking about people, some people are pre-contemplative, they don't want to have anything to do with it, but those aren't people that are in your office. You've moved past that. So part of what we do in Readiness and Alliance, I mentioned that, trying to move people along. And so if you build that alliance, if you're underscoring the importance of the need for treatment, people might not want to do it right away, but if you have that alliance, you move them along, you're closer to having them want to get help. But we deal with that type of resistance all the time, and I think that's where motivational interviewing, trying to meet somebody where they are, is a very good start.
Thank you.
Yep, right there.
I wonder if you could speak to the increase of use in young people and the correlation, if there's any correlation between that and sort of the sports culture now, where sports are like 7 days a week and there's all these extra teams, and whether it's an increase in injury and therefore prescription use or
Interesting.
performance.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I usually have heard all the questions, but I haven't heard that one before. So talking about increased substance use relative to the sports culture and travel teams and things like that. And again, it's very different. I've had a modest athletic career, and it's very different from what I'm used to. People are starting a lot earlier. I didn't get to year-round play till high school, at least in an organized way. So, I think that there are more injuries, definitely. I think so. You're more likely to come across an opioid prescription, and so that definitely is. I'm not as familiar with the statistics there, but certainly anecdotally, we see people who have overuse injuries, hips, baseball. Rotator cuff and that sort of thing, and when you're prescribed an opioid, again, anybody who's prescribed an opioid, it's a high risk thing, and so we do see that. I think it is a major issue, and one to be wary of, and there are people who know a lot about sports that don't advocate for that type of specialization at an early age, and I think that's one of the reasons is that your bodies just aren't made to do that. If you do get one of those injuries, then you might be opening up the door to these other issue. That's a good point. Right there in the back.
Could you mention what your thoughts are about naltrexone and Vivitrol?
Yeah, so the question was, what are my thoughts about naltrexone? Vivitrol is the brand name. So naltrexone is an opioid blocker. And so it's FDA approved for treatment for alcohol use disorders and opioid use disorders. Vivitrol is a brand name, injectable naltrexone. And so, I like naltrexone. I think it's a good medicine. Whether you need to be injectable or not, that's more of a debate. I'm less of a fan. It's expensive. You can get it in a pill form too. But I think the point is that I think that addiction works in a lot of common pathways. And so an opioid blocker may be helpful for opioids and alcohol, and maybe other addictions as well. My big thing with medications for addiction is that I think you got to have the other pieces in place before you use a medication, right? So if somebody comes to me and they want a script for naltrexone, that's all they're going to do for alcoholism or an opioid addiction. It's not going to work. I just don't think so. But if you have a therapist, you're talking to somebody every week, you're working with these dry dock folks, you're going to self-help groups, you're doing all these other things, then yeah, I'm all for using a medication in that way. I just worry that a lot of patients that we see aren't doing all the things they need to do. And I know it's hard, right? Nobody wants to see me every week, right? And I think that it'd be a lot easier if I just took a pill every day. And so I know there's that temptation, but when you think about it, we got this huge problem that you've developed over years that's impacting all these areas of your life. It's wrecking your life. You think a bottle of pills is going to fix it? It's relative. That's kind of simplistic, So I think they're a good tool to have. I like to use medications when appropriate. I just worry sometimes that people have too great of expectations of medicines to be magic bullets. It doesn't work like that. Yep, right next to there. The green shirt.
There was a death a couple weeks ago of a young person in South Shore from heroin, fentanyl overdose, but it was from pot that was laced with heroin, fentanyl. And I guess that's drug dealers on the South Shore. It might be more commonplace that are dealing
Yeah, actually, there was a question that came up yesterday. I have to say, I mean, anything is possible. I'm not doubting the truth of the story. I see a lot of people with marijuana problems. I don't see a lot of marijuana that is adulterated in many ways. Really, it's more about how strong can we get it. How much, and if if marijuana, the plant itself, we'll even talk about the different forms today. But if the marijuana that you get is not strong enough for you, then you look into other forms. So there's hash oil, distilling marijuana down into really, really pure THC, which is the active ingredient. So that's the race that I see more so than people getting marijuana that has other stuff in it. Opioids definitely cut a lot, or ecstasy and other things. But yeah, somebody raised a similar question. So that made, a lot of times these things are kind of the curve. Somebody like me may be a bit slow to catch up to the curve. The first responders and the police are, on the front lines, and so they may catch things a bit earlier than me. I mean, I talk to a lot of patients, but I hadn't heard much about that. Marijuana being cut. I mean, certainly people may dip marijuana in formaldehyde, things like that, but I'm not familiar with opioids and marijuana being mixed like that. So that's something new, and I appreciate you sharing that. Yep.
Can you just speak to the use of synthetic marijuana?
Yeah, synthetic marijuana. So that's, again, we could talk about things like this all night, but I have my own synthetic marijuana talk, essentially. And like I said, I do a lot of work in sports, and so we'll talk about why that's relevant with synthetic marijuana. Synthetic marijuana, K2 spice, but it could be a whole bunch of things. I mean, it's kind of a cat and mouse game. The government has made certain forms of it illegal. What it is are synthetic versions of THC. So THC is like what we call an agonist, a powerful piece of marijuana that makes you high. When you have the marijuana plant, you got a whole bunch of pieces in it, cannabinoids, 60, 80 cannabinoids. THC is the main one that makes you high. CBD cannabidiol is the one that you've probably heard of. That's kind of like a buffer for THC. Synthetic marijuana, you don't have any buffer. So you got a pure THC-like compound, and so you get the best and the worst. You can have a powerful high, but the problems with marijuana usually are paranoia, psychosis, things like that. And so with no buffer, you're more likely to have the bad things happen with synthetic marijuana. Who uses synthetic marijuana? People who are going to be drug tested. So group home residents, military, the athletes that I mentioned, if you're going to get drug tested in spring training, or you're in the program, substance abuse program. So so synthetics are a real problem. On the whole, a bag of synthetic weed is much more dangerous than regular marijuana. So it's a major, major problem. Yep.
Is there anything being done to prohibit convenience stores for self?
Yeah, so the DEA is trying. That they K2 and spice, like I mentioned, has a certain chemical formula, and so the DEA has outlawed, certain forms, but these are made in China essentially, and so you can tweak the formula, have a new product out. I know communities are trying to discourage convenience stores and head shops from selling, but it's hard. People want to make money, and sometimes people sell dangerous substances. These are nasty, nasty drugs. Really, really harsh and powerful. Yep.
How do you feel about the two theories, tough love versus, love, just when it comes to drug addiction?
So how do I feel about tough love versus love?
Well, I know it's weird, unless you've gone to learning to cope or
That's a great.
meetings for families. That seems to be part of the discussion. Different families using those two.
Yep. No. So what we're talking about is somebody has a problem with addiction, and it's a long-term problem. They've been in treatment multiple times. At what point do you pull away? Do you not let them stay in your house? Do you not give them money? It's a really, really tough position to be in. People, family members get worn out, that sort of thing. Every case is different, and what I want to emphasize, what I think is important to emphasize, and I know families do this to a large degree, is look, we're here for you. We want to help you. You want to get help. We want to help you, but some things are not helpful. Giving you cash, is not going to be helpful for you. Sometimes people make really difficult decisions about, look, we can't, essentially enable this kind of behavior. And so those are really, really tough spots. And another difficult aspect of it is you can give somebody an ultimatum and say, look, you got to do this or we're not going to do this. But ultimately, the person that's saying that is the one that's making a choice, right? They've already decided what they're going to do. So now are you really not going to let them sleep in your house? I mean, these are heart-wrenching, difficult spots. What I would say is, every case is different. I would say if you're, and I know you mentioned Learn to Cope, which is a great organization, it's really helped a lot of people. But you need to be working with one of those groups. If you're facing that, that's really advanced level stuff. And if you're at that point where, you've spent a lot of money on treatment, getting help, nothing's working, you need to have really high level people help you make those kind of decisions. I don't envy it. It's really sad. And like I said, many people, that I've worked with in the past have used substances to the point where they've died. They've drank themselves to death, and it can't happen. That's just terribly sad. So you try to do everything you can, and there are a lot of people out there that are doing everything they can, and it doesn't seem to be working. It's a really hollow place to be, an empty feeling. So that's where support groups are really helpful. Yep, on the right there.
What are your thoughts from comments regarding medical marijuana, and are you concerned or not concerned about the possibility of marijuana becoming legalized in our state?
Oh, good questions. So medical marijuana. So I've written a lot on medical marijuana. I do think that there are places, there's certain, we have 2 FDA-approved cannabinoids that are approved for 2 things, nausea and vomiting and appetite stimulation. Beyond those 2 things, I think there is good evidence for chronic pain, neuropathic pain, which is kind of a burning sensation you get in your nerves, and spasticity associated with multiple sclerosis. So my thing is, there is a place for medical marijuana, not as a first-line treatment, but as a treatment for a certain number of conditions. The problem is, in the Commonwealth and many other states, you got people using marijuana for this many things. And so I think the regulations are poor. Second question, am I concerned about legalization? Yeah, you bet I am. Because the ballot initiative that we're going to vote on November 8th, I think it is just, it's not very good in my view. And I could tell you why if you want, but it's weak. So conceptually, whether adults should be able to use it, that's a whole other story. But when you tell me that you got a law written by advocates that doesn't do certain things that you really need to do, I don't feel good about it. So I am concerned, and I'm also concerned that our legislature hasn't really done anything on the issue as well. So they're worrisome topics. Certainly. Yep, right in the middle.
Referring to the slide you had about teenagers who are binge drinking.
Yep.
Binge drinking, I think you said, is like three drinks in a day.
Yeah, it's rarely 3, right? I mean, we're talking about people who are having more than that, but yeah.
But do you have any numbers on how many of those, what percentage of those who are binge drinking go on to serious addiction?
Go on to what?
To addiction.
Well, so here's the thing. It's kind of changed recently in the sense that the latest diagnostic manual that we use, the DSM-5, captures both binge drinking and daily drinking as what we call an alcohol use disorder. So if you're somebody that habitually binge drinks, technically you do meet criteria for an alcohol use disorder and probably addiction by how we define it. It's not absolute. I mean, I can not drink very much and then have 10 on Saturday and, end up in a world of hurt. That doesn't mean I probably don't meet criteria, but most of the time it's something that somebody continues to do over time. So we'll take a couple more questions and I'll stay down here. I know they've got some great tables out that people want to have you go to. Yep.
observation, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I should say it seems to be a patient who has to request something beyond narcotic for a surgery or an accident or something or sports injury. It's somewhat surprising, although I know that with the awareness and the amount of use from this kind of pain pill to an opioid or some other addiction, knowing that pharmaceutical companies are making thousands of dollars on distress. What are the
Millions.
What are the trends and discussions, if any, towards regulations or some sort of restriction?
Yeah.
on the amount of-
Yep, so we're talking about trends and trying to restrict prescription opioid prescriptions. And so, yeah, so this is a major epidemic. There are a lot of people, the Mass Medical Society, people are into the government, people are doing what they can to do this. I also want to say that, opioids are very, very useful medicines in certain cases. I'm just saying that, any powerful medicine that we decide to take, you got to weigh the risks and the benefits. And there are times when you should use them and they can be very, very helpful. But we know that they're overprescribed. And so there are things that people are doing. We're educating more doctors about this. We want people to use what's called a prescription monitoring program. So if I'm going to prescribe an opioid, I need to look at the prescription monitoring program to see if this person has gotten scripts elsewhere, if they may be somebody that might have a problem with addiction, that sort of thing. So there are a lot of steps. The governor has talked about 7-day max limit to the number of opioids that you could prescribe. So I think there are steps being taken, definitely, and maybe it's something where there's going to be a bit of a lag for us to see the results. So hopefully we'll see some results soon. But a lot of people are doing a lot of good things, I think, on that end. Hopefully we're going to keep doing more rather than just talking about it. So that's why this kind of night is great. So I'll take one more and then I'll stay down there to answer some more questions. Anybody else? Yep, right there.
Thank you for doing this.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I do this around the area as well, and I just wanted to ask the question, if people wouldn't mind raising their hand, how many parents are here tonight? Oh, God bless you. God bless you for coming. I don't know why you came, but thank you for coming, because it's very hard to get parents out here to these education meetings that are so vital, because you don't know what you don't know, and what you don't know can kill your kids. And as I'm a family practitioner here on the Cape, and I speak to many of the points that he's made tonight, parents have to be part of the solution, and part of that is educating yourself about what to look for and how to have that conversation. And also how to handle your own medications responsibly, because most of the pill use in kids is right out of the family medicine cabinet first. And so handling your own medications, handling your own thoughts and emotions about how you speak about drug use, how you talk about people who have substance use disorders, may make it difficult for your child who may have a problem to come to you if they think you're going to be judgmental or stigmatizing them. So taking sort of your own educational and emotional pulse about where you stand. Do you feel ambivalent about this? Are you, as a kid of the 60s, 70s, or 80s, still using yourself? All those messages affect if your child will even come to you if you have a problem. So I thank you so much for coming to this program tonight, and try to get other parents to come to more programs, because the education is just as important for parents as it is for the young people.
That's a great point. Thanks.